Muchísimas gracias. Pues muy interesantes todas las mesas que se han dado
Thank you. All
el
the panels
momento en
that we
este
have
segundo
had have
foro
been very
internacional
interesting so
de la
far in the
innovación en la
second
justicia,
International Forum
organizado
on
por México
Justice
Evalúa y la
Innovation,
Fundación
organized by
Friedrich Naumann.
Mexico Evalúa
A
and
continuación,
Foundation
tendremos
Frederick
la
Naumann.
mesa de género y grupos en condiciones de
Right now, we will
vulnerabilidad
have the
para
panel
entender la
Gender
justicia
and
inclusiva.
Groups in Vulnerability Conditions to
Moderan
Understand
Alejandra
Inclusive
Nuño,
Justice.
del
We
Centro
have Alejandra
Universitario por
Nuño
la
as
Dignidad y la
facilitator. She
Justicia
comes
Francisco
from the
Suárez,
University Center for
Wendy
Dignity
Jarquín
and Justice
Orozco,
Francisco
de la
Suárez,
Escuela
Wendy
Judicial
Jarquín
Electoral del
Orozco
Tribunal
from the
Electoral del Poder
Electoral
Judicial de la
Judicial School of
Federación,
the Electoral
José
Court of
Rafael
the
Grijalva
Judiciary,
Eternoz, del
José
Instituto
Rafael
Nacional de las
Grijalva
Ciencias
Eternot from the
Penales,
National Institute
Kate
of Criminal
Artigues
Sciences,
Boveda, de la Fundación Yo También, y Gloria
from
Manzotti,
Foundation Yo
asesora
También,
regional de
and
Estado de
Gloria
Derecho,
Manzotti,
Justicia,
Regional Advisor
Seguridad y
for
Derechos
the
Humanos
Rule
del
of Law,
Programa de
Justice,
Naciones Unidas para el
Security, and Human
Desarrollo
Rights from the
en América
the
Latina y el Caribe. Doy la
United
palabra a
Nations
Alejandra
Development
Núñez.
Program.
Muchas gracias.
Now I will give the floor to Alejandra. Thank you very much. Welcome to this 16th panel, this panel of the last day from the Second International Forum on Justice Innovation. I am very glad to be here. It is a privilege for me to be facilitating this panel, which is related to the discussion, to other discussions. The other panels have also mentioned and have been reflecting on the relevance of why we need to have, besides the systems that bring justice in a country with really high levels of impunity and high problems in terms of just the administration of justice, why is it additionally important to consider certain sectors that are in a situation of greater vulnerability and exclusion in many countries, but without a question, Mexico is not an exception. I am very glad to have Katia, Wendy, Jose, and Gloria in this panel. And with no further comments, because the idea is that we listen to the experts in this space, I would like to start with the explanation of the dynamics that we're going to have in this panel. We're going to have two questions. The first one is for our panelists to create some reflections in 7 minutes, and then we will have a second question for which I would ask you to give us additional ideas in 4 minutes. I would like to introduce the first person that is going to be with us, and then I would start with the trigger question. Katia de Artis, she is a reporter, and she writes on the rights of people with disabilities. She has been in different media, and she founded Comunicación para la Inclusión, a civil society organization that is a nonprofit organization that works for people with disabilities. We need to talk about intersectionalities. We need to remember the multiple discrimination that we still have and that many of these people have in Mexico. Katia is currently co-founder of Yo También, Discapacidad, and it's the only 100% accessible communication media that talks about accessibility and inclusion. She was also advisor of CONAPRED, the National Council to Avoid Discrimination, UNICEF Mexico, and she is associate of Libre Acceso ACE and advisor of CIPINA. I have followed her, and I had never had the opportunity of being with Katia in a panel, so I would start asking you, why do you consider that it's necessary to adopt a gender approach that is intersectional, cross-sectional for justice, so that we can create an inclusive system. Thank you very much for your participation. We have 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Alejandra. I would like to greet everyone who are here and the people who are seeing us. I would like to start with some figures, because we usually believe that people with disabilities are just a few of them and they are somewhere else. We're talking about 15% of the world's population. We had very interesting figures. 16.5% of the population in Mexico has a disability. We are talking about 20 million people that if we multiply it by a family from INEGI, 80 million people in Mexico will live with someone with disability in our houses. And these are people that usually are denied the rights to access everything, including justice. We have very few disaggregated data of what happens with these people with disabilities and access to justice, because we usually think of visible disabilities and not invisible disabilities. We think about a person with a motor in a disability, someone who is in a wheelchair, but we do not think of those people who are dealing with the police and have a greater incidence with these things, or are in prison, because based on data from the US or the UK who are taking them into account, these are people with intellectual disabilities or with psychosocial disabilities, or people who cannot hear, and that when facing the police and they start moving their hands because they are trying to communicate, the first reaction of the police officers is to handcuff them or to try to put them down, because we're saying that there's not a good training for the law enforcement. We do not talk about the accessibility of this justice chain. So from the proper training of the police officers, the public prosecutors, the physical access to the places where they can arrive and present a complaint. For instance, if you are deaf and you need a sign language interpreter that helps you to establish your claim, it's very unlikely yet that you get them quickly, and also that it's a certified interpreter in justice, because there are only 30 interpreters that are certified in these matters in the whole country, and this is really harsh. And also a certified interpreter that has a gender perspective. For instance, if you are a woman that is a victim of violence, we know that there are more women and girls that face problems and violence issues, up to 10 times more than women without disabilities. And this is information from the United Nations. So this is wrong wherever we see it. The United Nations in August 2020 released a document that I think is very important to recommend, which is called International Principles and Directives for Access to Justice for Disabled People. And the rapporteur for people with disabilities, Catalina de Bandas, who is no longer there, and we have right now another person, but Catalina de Bandas did some great work. The International Disability Alliance is an umbrella organization that represents all people with disabilities in the world. They have these 10 principles, and if we read them, they may seem obvious, but the truth is that in disability, when talking about disabilities, nothing is obvious. They say that the facilities and services should have universal access. People should be able to enter to guarantee equality and access to justice for people with disabilities. People with disabilities have the right to have access to right procedures, and this is something that we need to socialize. Despite having them in our legislations, very few people know about this. And I have a lawyer that works here in Mexico City, and she documents that she does it with the court in Mexico City to accompany in their procedures the people with disabilities that require it, in order to do these adjustments in the procedures that sometimes are as simple as making the judge open to the explanation of that they need to explain the people with the person with disabilities what they are being accused of, because there is something that is very common. In Mexico, usually people with disabilities are denied their judicial capability, and that's a really big issue. The Commission on the Rights of People with Disabilities that is part of our Constitution after the historical reform from the first article in the Constitution says that all people with disabilities have judicial capability. We need to find how to support them so that they can be supported. And they are usually denied access to this. So we consider that a blind person cannot be a witness, and or a deaf person cannot be witness as well, or a person with intellectual capability, disability, even if they were raped, they are told that it was their fault, for instance. So they need to have the right to have access to all information, and that is also something that they are denied because they don't have access. And we know that legal language is very difficult to understand for anyone, let alone for disabled people. So we need to have this in easy reading, for instance, in Braille, in the different types. And every time we mention this, it seems as if we were speaking Japanese. So there are different types of procedures, and we need to do different programs of sensitization of this information of the people with disabilities and the whole chain of justice. And we need to have surveillance mechanisms that are solid and efficient from the civil society organizations, because we need to remember that this Commission for the Rights of People with Disabilities in Mexico proposed to the world, thanks to Gilberto Rincón Gallardo in the UN. It's the convention, the most recent, the most avant-garde, and I say that if we apply this convention, since it's so wide, because people with disabilities are such an heterogeneous group, because we have people with visual, motor, neurodivergent disabilities, a lot of disabilities, we are opening the door not only to them, but all the people, actually. When we make a door that is large enough, everyone can fit in. So we should do that more. They have access to free legal advice. I think in this regard, Mexico is doing a good job through the public defenders, and they have 32 advisors in these disability issues, and they are doing a good job. But I think that we really need more. Obviously, we need gender perspective, but we need this perspective of disability as well, and we need to establish how people may have access to justice every day. I would just leave it with this overview in general. In Mexico, interesting things are happening, such as the case of Arturo Medina, who is the first person that the Mexican government offered a public apology to. They need to repair the damage. I think it was a month ago. It was a problem with the state, a litigation after 4 years. This was 10 years ago. Arturo is a person with psychosocial and intellectual disability who was accused of stealing a car when he cannot drive. And because of this disability, he was denied the possibility of receive a defense. So this is a clear effect of how we still see people with disabilities as subjects of treatment instead of subjects of justice. He was in prison for 4 years. Then he was able to go out, and then the Commission of Human Rights recognized that he received a lot of violations of his human rights. And I think right now things are changing, and I think I ran out of time. Thank you very much, Katia. And I think it's very important to see the lack of statistics, but also to understand that Mexico is part of the international convention. This convention that also speaks about inclusion regarding gender since 2008, and Mexico had presented a document on this topic of the legal capacity. And in Mexico, we also have a general law for the inclusion of people with disabilities since 2011. And they are also trying to cross it with disability and gender in other suspicious categories. So thank you very much for reminding us how important it is that we can also see other situations and other categories that may make access to justice for people even more complex. Now I would ask Jose Grijalva to take the floor. Jose Rafael Grijalva Eternot. He has a degree in law by UNAM. He has studies in sociology by the Metropolitan Autonomous University. He is a professor in international law by Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Jose has published different papers nationally and internationally. He is a researcher in the UN. He has been the director of the School of Law and the University of Claustro de San Juana, and he has also worked in human rights with the current Commission of Human Rights in Mexico City. He is also a member of the autonomous group on forced disappearance in Coahuila, and he has also collaborated with Universidad Iberoamericana. He is right now professor of INACIPE as associate researcher of the faculty of the School of Bioethics, and he is also in the group Checks and Balances, and he also works in public policies and human rights. Thank you very much, Alejandra. It's a pleasure for me to see you and to share the space with Katia, Gloria, and Wendy. And I think that they will mention more interesting elements than me, but I think that a way of addressing this question, what is the importance of the gender approach related to justice? We may analyze this from a historical perspective, also from a perspective where we can understand that this idea of human rights and gender cannot be divided, and also the general model of human rights. I think that these three elements can be joined in a very interesting way and allow us to understand and say this thing that in another context, an Italian professor said that human rights have a certain type of original sin. I think that this liberal model of human rights based on gender is related to this original sin. And I think that if we analyze the French Revolution as the start point of this liberal movement, we may analyze different moments. The French Revolution is a moment that had a great impact, not only because of the flags that they had, but the social groups that they included in the movement. It's a movement that included the workers, the farmers, and they also included women. So in the assembly of the revolutionaries, there were different declarations where they included specific chapters of rights for workers, rights for farmers, and rights for women. But they were changing in other versions, and we reached a final declaration, which we call the French Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen. So we have two specific categories that are established from this start of the liberal state. Rights, yes, but for men. Rights, yes, but for citizens and men. Maybe I would say that this is a more objective or real name of this declaration would have been the Declaration of Rights for the white and men who owned something, and those who didn't fit there, they would be left behind. So some of the things that were mentioned here and why it was said that the rights of women that were contemplated initially, they didn't have to be there, and they said because it's generating a delicate constitution. And why is it delicate? Because the feminist revolutionary movement was being used by the Black community that was in in France and by children. So it's a movement that is using a lot of things. So they said that it was delicate and it was very tender, and there is a fragile reasoning because they are intellectually inferior. So this liberal movement, in a model of these liberal women, it was not related to this Republican women model that we have seen in literature, in culture. These women that, as long as they are not mothers, they are just the lovers of men. But when they become mothers, they become the caretakers of the children and of the men in order to turn them into good citizens. So that's the liberalism that we could see there. And that's why Oli, who had belonged to this group and who had established this chapter of women's rights, when he published this chapter of the rights of French women, he received as a prize that he went to the guillotine. So this means that this part was taken out because of this. And it's necessary to adopt a gender approach to establish justice models that are inclusive and proper. First of all, because we have a historical debt with the revolutionary feminism. This is the first thing that we would have to highlight, because this revolutionary feminism was not only given in France, but it has been part of many social movements. Why? Because this debt comes from a series of vulnerabilities that women have suffered historically. When I'm in class, I do an exercise in which I do a role play. And in this role play, I put volunteers in different roles. Someone is going to be a business person from Monterrey. Someone else is going to be a foreigner. Someone else is going to be an indigenous person. Everyone has a role, and then I give them different situations and different circumstances. I say, do you have access to internet? Do you have running water? You finish high school? Do you have a major? And every time they say yes or no, they need to give a step ahead or a step back. And the idea is that if we have this liberal movement of rights would have been inclusive, all people should be giving a step ahead. And in the end, everyone should be at the same level. But the reality is that this line is very different for everyone. And this shows the distance of the structural inequalities. And in all the exercises that I have done, there is always a white man that owns something at the front, and on the back, we have the opposite. We have a non-white girl that doesn't own anything. So this means that this original scene, beyond the constitutional reform and beyond the fact that we have created a system that is based on human rights, we have not been able to leave behind this original sin. And why is this approach important? Because this gender approach means that we have a political intention. There is an intentionality in the use of power, because that's what feminists did in France. That's why they were concerned about girls and Black people, of those who don't have power. So it's a political dimension that, as French feminism did it, it recognizes, acknowledges the existence of inequality, of discrimination, and it's active. It's looking for the construction of equitative decisions. That's what I would have to say. Thank you, Jose. To remember where we come from and where we have not been able to go. After centuries of exclusion, we are still seeing, and I was trying to think about the different cases of the different rulings. Half of the rulings are related to severe violations of human rights towards women and girls. We can remember different cases of women that are victims of sexual violence and torture in El Salvador Atenco. Now Dina Ochoa, with vision and gender approach, she is a defender of human rights. And we need to remember these two cases that were very, very important. And it was because of a case of sexual violence towards a girl. Inés Fernández Ortega and Rosa Antina. They were indigenous in the state of Guerrero, and from that moment, the Supreme Court of the country started thinking about these action protocols for the operators. And the first of them was the protocol to establish justice with a gender approach. So thank you very much for this reminder. And with this, I will introduce our third speaker, Wendy. She has a major in law in the University in Nicaragua. I will show all my solidarity with Nicaragua, and she has a PhD in law by the University of Castilla de la Mancha. She has different postgraduate degrees. She has different master degrees in the constitutional guarantees from the perspective of the 21st century. She's a specialist in constitutional justice, fundamental rights, and writs of amparo, and also a specialist in different types of law. And she has also been a lecturer in the constitutional part in the Supreme Court in Nicaragua. She's professor in constitutional law in Nicaragua. And from 2009 to 2018, having participated in the organization of different congresses and seminars in constitutional law, she has also participated in different research projects. She has given different conferences. And currently she is a professor and researcher from the electoral justice from the Electoral Court. Wendy, the same question for you, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Alejandro. For me, it's an honor to share this panel with Gloria Gatia, with you and Jose Francisco. I'm going to focus, to approach my question from the electoral justice perspective, which is the topic on which I am working. And from this very little known perspective, how a constitutional court that protects, therefore, human rights and an institution that is responsible for eliminating excluding paradigms for the citizens in a democracy. And I'm speaking here not just about women, but also indigenous people, homeless people, people in prisons, disabled people, people who have been excluded from the exercise of their political rights. And as we were saying, and Jose Francisco was saying, this starts from inequalities. It's important to have this gender focus and to use a different lens when we assess, when we study cases involving vulnerable groups. Because this approach will allow us to identify and eradicate stereotypes that sometimes we have considered as standardized in our culture and that prevent us from reaching a substantive equality in reality. And this approach is also interesting, and it's important to speak about the human rights approach and the differential approach that allows us to identify and acknowledge the differences of gender, ethnicity, age, and its implications to achieve a transformation and as in elimination of exclusion and discrimination, and of course with a disabled perspective and the inclusion perspective. In terms of gender, the electoral tribunal has been building from the moment these approaches are incorporated a jurisprudential line, which is very rich in inclusion matters. For instance, we could name the decision Ante Juanitas of 2011, in which we acted against the resistance of political parties of comply then with the affirmative action of gender quotas when they were proposing women candidates to have to comply with the law. And then we have seen how this has moved forward the integration of representation in lists, proportional integration, affirmative actions. It has been set forth, as it is said in international treaties, that these are not discriminatory. These are measures that are there to act against discrimination, and we are moving towards parity in Mexico, and we have advanced in this way. in the governor offices, and also we have a historical decision from which we achieved parity at the Congress, and I hope that this will then be known as the Congress of Women and Men, and this has to become a substantive parity reality. This highlights the fact that sometimes the legislation isn't necessary, but ends up being insufficient to achieve inclusion. And for this, we need a further participation of our authorities and of the citizens. And in the case of the electoral authorities, we are missing this open approach acting with regards to substantive integration. Today, we could think we have parity integration at the chambers of deputies, and there is no more to do. This is to fool ourselves with a false idea of equality, and maybe maybe this resistance is not as before, but there are barriers that we have to overcome to achieve this substantive parity. And so we find that people we have gotten to political positions, but not leadership positions. We're still getting the chair, but not the place. And then we have this political violence phenomenon against women, which is not a new phenomenon. It has existed from the fight for women's right to vote. And this is delimited. We know that last year in Mexico, legislative reform was approved, introducing the classification of political violence against women that sets forth clearly that this violence can go against men. The difference is they are not attacked because they are men, which is the case of women. Prior to this reform, the Electoral Tribunal had already been issuing jurisprudence here, legal cases, because in Mexico, we have treaties in these matters against violence against women. And we had an electoral sanction. And then people in the position being punished for this, well, we took off many pieces of advertisement with sexist messages, and we considered the cancellation of elections because of the same topic. For the first time, an election would have been annulled in the case of the Atenco municipality. The use of this gender approach and of human rights has adopted measures to facilitate access of women to effective judicial protection. And that's a flexible standard because these new barriers and gender political violence are expressed in other ways. So it's difficult for women to prove that they are being subject to such a situation. And therefore, the evidence system has been changed, and the burden of the proof as well. So we have to show that an act was not because of discrimination. The value assigned to the victims says with testimonial, and also in the best interest of a victim, we have adopted now reputation guarantees to not leave them in a state of insecurity. This is just an outlook of how these approaches are essential so we can really achieve effective access to justice in the electoral field. Thank you very much, Wendy, for giving us such a possible example of the progress in legislative terms and judicial terms. specifically in the electoral field, and we are still missing, right? How this lack of leadership or crystal floors, roofs are still reflected in matter attitudes of political parties, because they want to leave the most remote municipalities to women, and it seems the party is still not important, and the differentiated approach, the gender and human rights approach that permeates ever more to into the Mexican legislation, but we still don't know how it works. What's a differentiated approach for you, or a gender or a disabled focus approach? Is different for people, including judges, to tell us what a differentiated approach is about, and the evidence burden and the assessments that we have for a decision. We have had an activist already. We have had someone from the academia, a judicial servant, and of course, we would need an international servant in this panel. So for me, it's a pleasure to introduce Gloria Manzotti. She has over 17 years of experience of work in the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. She has worked in different Latin American countries. She has worked on several field projects. She has provided assistance to the different UNDP offices, the region government, especially for citizens' access to human rights. She has supported several programs to support and promote citizens' rights, the prevention of conflicts. She has provided counseling and public policies for these topics in different places of Latin American thinking about the justice systems in our region, and of course, including the human rights agenda. Maria has also combined her academic experience with the public function, and she has also been part of the management team of the airport law enforcement team. She has led the design of the police training institute, and she worked on the rule of law in Argentina. Before having this position, she worked at the UNDP at the Panama office, and she has consolidated strategic alliances by mobilizing resources for new strategies. Evidently, she has actively promoted innovation and the link between the 2030 agenda and the human rights and youth inclusion. She has contributed to create new knowledge and tools for action in terms of gender and rule of law. So it's a real pleasure for us, who is a regional counseling of the UNDP for Latin America and the Caribbean office, to be with us today. The floor is yours, Gloria. Thank you very much, Alejandro, for your moderation. I know that the minutes are starting to be counted, but I would like to take this opportunity to thank, and for me, it's to thank you, and for me, it's a pleasure to share this panel with Jose Francisco and Wendy and Katia. For us, it's a pleasure as the UNDP for Latin America and the Caribbean, but I also want to thank the UNDP of Mexico who are with us today on the platform. What better than to contribute to reflections? I would like to frame the challenges that we have been faced with, and we have considering that the region has been highly impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, and we were surprised to see this health crisis that became quickly an inclusion crisis, a crisis of rights that showed those structural inequalities and expedited the implementation of those urgent institutional implementations, which we have seen an exacerbation of discriminations, inequalities, and unfortunately the risk of increase of institutional violence. Crisis from the UNDP has a power crisis in terms of governance in this sense, and also crisis consists of an opportunity to rearrange institutions, people, and the relations between them and between people themselves, and also from the justice perspective as well as access to justice, how justice is an enabler for the generation of opportunities. Those who came before highlighted the urgent challenges for specific populations. And from here, I want to tell you that the UNDP, following the Pathfinder Working Group globally, we started to develop that series of conversations and research, and I'm going to tell you about this in a little bit, but how we could achieve this ambition of justice for everyone. That's justice that really engages in achieving or in not leaving any border behind. That's the 2030 agenda motto. But for this agenda, we have a specific goal about transparent institutions with quality responses and efficiency. That's SDG 16, and we have a specific goal oriented to or aiming at giving an answer there that we have seen in our region, and that is a part of the problem. Either we incorporate this dimension to the analysis, or we won't be able to transcend neither the realities we have nor the public service model that we've got. Again, how can we reorient this by focusing on users, on people? Because that's the only way so we can think again about those services and we can ensure rights. It's the only way we have found to face digitalization and innovation processes that are arriving to the Latin American justice systems. And how are we going to make them accessible to all? That's the conversation that we are having. The COVID-19 crisis, well, during this time we developed a report based on the region's experiences that I'm going to leave at your disposal, which is called Innovations and Urgent Transformation Towards an Inclusive Justice, a possible translation. And we started to collect the experiences and the first measures that the justice systems of Latin America and the Caribbean were taking to understand how we can have peer-to-peer support, and we identified a myriad here of experiences of access to justice, how we can take it out of the desk and take it to the communities, and how we are going to find tools so we can face or experience-based tools and experience and recommendations-based tools, as was the case of digitalization, when we started to have access to justice services, but as users are through platforms who have been to virtual hearings. But how can we do this in a arena where we still have the challenge of the technology access gap? And in here, you will be able to find different experiences. And we also devoted some good time to think about gender. We immediately addressed the prevention and assistance services of gender-based violence in the health crisis context. And in such a context, women were the main victims, because lockdown led to scenarios in which we had the perpetrator at home 24/7. I'm going to say this very quickly, but in those activations, I recommend the experiences and to go back to get in touch with the spotlight experiences in different countries. Protocols and mechanisms have been adopted to guarantee access to justice, coverage, and due process as well. So we can have protection measures. But it was also interesting to see that whether we think about access to justice as the social inclusion enabler, we would not only need to address issues from the criminal justice perspective. How can we create access, equal access and equal opportunities for women from another jurisdiction, that is by providing justice access tools? I loved Wendy, how she shared the perspective of the electoral justice and its challenges. We also have challenges here, and I can tell you and recommend that you follow closely the Chilean experience just in political violence, and not just against women, but the composition of a new institutional architecture that is being built, and also the Honduran experience and that of Mexico. Going back to the creation of opportunities, and I'm running out of time right now, but it was the need to rethink services. We don't need a huge resource investments. When we translated the processes that did not need an attorney into indigenous languages, we have seen how the justice systems open the possibility for indigenous people to have access to land ownership, divorce. The opportunities we have are huge. And as I have run out of time, I want to close with the next message. This is possible as well if we redefine what we understand as a gender in the justice sector, because if we continue considering the amount of judges in Latin America who are part of the Supreme Court, if we continue to see challenges as, if you consider the challenges for public defense in Brazil, the main percentage of women as requesting for assistance are Afro-descendant young women. The system has as in their alpha white men. And well, this is just one example of many. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much, Gloria, for reminding us how the pandemic boosted the inequalities that we all knew. And it's created further conflicts and violence indices, violence against women and girls who have suffered it during these times. And how I think that it's really important, not just what you were saying about rethinking about the services and thinking about access to justice as an enabler of equality, and how we're even thinking about our social justice systems. I'm going to take this idea with me in gender violence cases in Mexico, and quite surely in all of the Latin American countries. Usually the lady goes to a family court to raise a complaint or to request for divorce, but she also goes to the criminal court, or maybe she's still looking for the custody of her children, and then she goes to the criminal court to raise a complaint against the violence, and maybe then she goes to another court to ask or request for some type of assistance. As you were saying, it's very important to think again about services in different places for them to be more comprehensive and effective for women and all those people who have conditions that disables them access to have access to justice, or makes it even more difficult. And now we're going to the second part, again in the same order as we started. I would like to us to think about why we must think in gender terms, but and Jose was mentioning this. We have some barriers that with which some groups are faced in terms of access to justice or due process, and how innovations could help build a more inclusive continent, like Gloria mentioned. Katia, the floor is yours. First of all, I want to say that I'm very happy. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that I forgot to describe myself. I think I'm always doing this when I'm in a panel like this. We forget that a person, like a blind person, can be watching, and it's important to say that I am a middle-aged woman with hair all the way out down to my shoulders. I am having some, I'm using some red glasses, and I have a Mafalda, a statue of Mafalda, of the Mafalda character, because I am her fan, and also to emphasize the fact that we need accessibility a lot. This is one of the main barriers to justice and for everyone. Usually we forget accessibility, right? So this is just a tiny detail, and I think that we do not have an interpreter in sign language, so we do not have any signing person who could have had access to these these reflections. One of the main barriers we have, sometimes they even have to look for protection. Even in the context of COVID, we were able to have information in the Mexican sign language for emergency situations. So one of the main challenges is intersectoriality, right? Because you were saying this, I think it's very important to have these guides for access to justice by the Supreme Court, and they're going through them. But then we had the LGBT community, indigenous people, and they don't think that they can have a trans indigenous woman, trans indigenous disabled woman. And we have to think about universal design. What so we are just one. Well, first of all, we are not things, right? We have different conditions and characteristics, and I mean every person. I want to speak about how technology can be level or something that is going to deepen the gap if we do not consider this based on a universal base, because now that we're speaking about injustice, and I think that this is great, if we do not do this based on a universal design, and only 1% of web pages are made like this, either for intellectual disabled people or blind people, that is like closing the doors on their faces. You cannot come here, and that's it. It's important to continue fighting against a culture that constantly discriminates. As Wendy said, we have these standardized stereotypes, right? That people with women, that disabled people are weak, and we are cute, and as we were saying, we still have a lot of people who continue to think in this way, and this should not be the case anymore. The Convention on the Human Rights of the Disabled People, it's been years that it was ratified in Mexico. However, it remains unknown for many matters and many other things. So I know that cultural changes take generations and most time, because they have this has to come from education. They learn to live together, and they know that but children have no problems. Those who have problems, to consider inclusion and see a person, a disabled people, or a successful woman. It's the adults. There's those who have this normalized stereotypes. I would say this. We have to work more on culture, and we have to continue working on accessibility, because it's a right that opens the door to the others' information, and also to for them to be able to have to work, to be everywhere. And I think that we have to try to eliminate this. This is one of the main barriers when we speak about women. Here I was saying just some very interesting report of a decade of their investigation lies. I interviewed one of their lawyers with regards to the topic of disabled people. It's amazing how up to now disabled women continue to be denied access to sexual and reproductive health services because they should not be mothers, or they are object to forced sterilization, right? Or abortions. So this is one abuse after another. So thank you. Thank you very much for those reflections, Katia. Jose, please. Yes, thank you, Alejandra. If we focus on justice, on the institutional justice, that's the one provided by courts and the prosecutor's offices, I would find three. I would like to speak about those minutes here that we still have. I see an epistemological barrier. How we are understanding justice. What do we understand as a justice, right? At different times, different organizations, the World Justice Project, justice is understood as something that is far from the citizens. Here we have an epistemological understanding of justice. It's not something that should be close to the citizen. This is not close to people. This is justice of intermediaries, secrecy, technical language. That's a big barrier. How can we jump over this? It's to have open justice, and not just open in terms of data, which is the main point, but open to dialogue. We have this initial figure, which is not even well regulated in Mexico, and even this is being set back, open in terms of a language, but a broad language, not just a verbal language. Of course, I celebrate that there are decisions by the judges with a language for children. I had to go for an amparo, and I celebrated that this decision by the judge had inclusive language for my daughter. But that's step one. I have to go from a semantic to a semiotic of justice, in which verbal language is included, but also the symbolic language, structural language. That would be the main barrier that I find about which we could speak a lot. Another one is a technical barrier. Justice focused on judges, and this is very evident, in which we are requesting for numbers to the justice, to our justice operators. How many are you detaining? How many are you going to imprison? And we focus on this, but not on the person without, again, that tool. This would be a personalist, that is a human-centered and a human dignity-centered approach, and it has to be focused on the characteristics and conditions. And forget that justice is blindfolded, and it has huge eyes going through every gap, through every difference, to allow for the assessment of a more technical model of justice. And I've always spoken about this anti-formalism or ethical formalism. The judges, for the judges to have some kind of control formality, just like they do for constitutionality. And those which are not important, they go aside. And finally, the operational way. We think open justice is, I'm going to open the doors for the citizens to go there. And also open citizens implies this open door for both parties. So for the citizens to go there, and also for the judges to go out, for the goal to have a social impact, an encounter with the context, and to have some kind of pilgrim justice in those cases where it's necessary, given the vulnerabilities and the specific conditions, for the justice to be a pilgrim to go meet the citizens and the vulnerable populations. The Roto Yaka case, which became very famous, it was not able to be solved because community could not pay go to the city of Oaxaca over and over. Why the court cannot go to the region in such an important case and with such peculiar characteristics? Those would be the three barriers that I would propose. Thank you, Jose. This is very interesting. Wendy. Thank you again. What has already been said. I'm going to focus also, as Katia said, on disabled people and the barriers that they have to face to have access to justice. As she said, we have the Convention on the Rights of the Disabled People, in which we're evolving. We have this evolution of the concept of disability that we have today as a disability, which is no longer a disease of the person. It's not a specific characteristic of an individual. It's a social construction problem of barriers that they are faced with. And I mean this group, either environmental, cultural, even a norm barriers. Product of this new conception, and this is that we have to assume a social responsibility, and we have to accommodate this as necessary for the disabled people can fully participate in all of the settings, including that of justice. And in the case of the electoral justice, the electoral tribunal has issued a criteria for which they make it clear that electoral authorities have to adopt measures guaranteeing effective access of people with disabilities to justice. What does this mean? Well, this means that we have to remove all of these contention dams that they encounter when they get to they approach justice. This means conditioning space, but also accompanying them throughout the process. At the electoral tribunal, we are still missing to have a public defense office, and this is set forth in that it's issued with this criteria by the electoral tribunal. And also, we are missing the issuance of decisions in accessible formats and have those reasonable conditions so people can have access to information. And Katia was already speaking about this. We have to make this conditioning of this information. We had a case at the electoral tribunal. This was a publicity split, and we were denouncing anticipated statements in the campaign. So we found that there were no anticipated facts, but it was found out that those publicity spots, so sometimes we are not sensitive to them. We had no accessibility for people, for disabled people, for hearing impaired people could have access to them. And then we had the opportunity for the chamber to invite and encourage political parties to include this accessibility in their publicity spots. And we had to include sign languages, and I mentioned this at the school. We have this barrier, having no translation into sign language, where a hearing impaired person can have access to our sessions. Something that has been established in the electoral tribunal. Now, with regards to the accessible notification, this has worked as well because of a case that a person had. We did not focus. We did not go to this. I thought that this case was a room for more for the political parties to include disabled people within and for the candidacies, and then we move in this sense. But from this moment, with this impaired person, people with this disability, they will be able to decide whether the clerk is going to read a copy of the sentence and can have a copy in a braille writing. As Katia was saying, we have also we have also to acknowledge, and this is an obligation by Mexico, and the convention is mentioning it for the fulfilling thereof. The judiciary has been working on this. It has not been the case of the electoral tribunal, but I'm going to close with a case. A person in vegetal state, they needed their ID to have access to their benefits. Then his son go to look for help, for assistance, to have access to social security. And there is an article established by of law that such as that we can whereby we can ask for a public servant to go to the individual's domicile. And then with this formalism that Jose Francisco is mentioning, he said, yes, we have the article, but I don't know if this can be applicable to this case. So I request Councilor to Ine Normative Secretary, yes, said yes, this is applicable. And then we have such a situation. And then we can, the servant will have to establish this clearly, precisely the intention of the ID cards holder. What was the purpose? So imagine, ask a person for his will and doubt for the ID. Then this goes to other jurisdictions, and because of the administrative, and it was clear that we have to act as the convention establishes with reasonable adjustments, and we have to be aware that when we do not conduct those adjustments, we are discriminating because of disability. We lack knowledge, awareness raising, and action, not just by the citizens, but also mainly of our authorities. Thank you very much, Wendy. We have no more time. Gloria, your last intervention, please. You're muted. Sure. I was saying, I call an urgent call to action from the Secretary of Justice, one of the last bastions of patriarchal institutions, to achieve those effective transformations obtained from public services focused on the person, for assistance and protection of women. Judicial institutions first have to transform themselves, and they have to have an intersectoral, intergenerational focus. It is not just a gender focused plan, but that reconstruction of the judicial institutionality that incorporates that gender policy within the organization, allowing to permit in a comprehensive way both the public policy of justice and the organization. There is an opportunity here. It's now or never in Latin America. That's the opportunity to conduct this actual transformation in matters of gender, for this not to be an isolated way. So this is one of the main pillars of the judiciary. Of course, we need a cultural, organizational, budget, political, and problems and engagement with concrete measures in the short term, mid and long term. And I want to say something. I invite you to get to know a little bit more about the gender seal of the UNDP for public institutions. While this has been a methodology that is present throughout our region, then we can start to have some experiences in the justice sector. We also have to incorporate in the planning, strategic planning processes of the justice sectors, how we're going to incorporate innovation, how we're going to incorporate this in the definition of the public service, and how we can reflect around access to justice, to have an inclusive justice present in all the national territories that can give us there's evidence of quality, transparency, and efficiency for the citizens. Otherwise, it's going to be very complex for us to have to have that perception, that credibility for the justice. Katia, Jose, Wendy, Gloria, this was an amazing panel. Thank you very much. There are questions from the public. Unfortunately, we have no more time for them, but I'm sure that the organizers will convey them to you. Thank you very much for this space of reflection about what we have done and what's amazing in terms of gender inclusion, but also in terms of other groups and vulnerable groups that need and have a right to justice. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be here.